The dinner was my aunt's idea. She called it a family gathering. That was the phrase she used. Gathering. Like we were leaves that had blown apart and needed someone to rake us back together once a year, so we could remember we belonged to the same yard. It was held at my cousin Philip's house. Long table, good china, the kind of dinner where somebody always says grace a little too long because they want everyone to know they mean it. I drove myself. I had been driving myself to family things for 11 years, since the last time I asked for a ride, and my mother said she wasn't sure they were going the same direction, even though we lived 12 minutes apart. I found a seat near the middle of the table, not the end, not beside my mother, the middle, where I could see everyone, and no one had to make a deliberate choice to look at me. The screen was already set up at the front of the room. Philip's company had been doing a regional partner dinner in the same venue for 3 years running, and he always let the family use the space the night before. Big projector, white screen, the kind of setup that made the room feel like something official was supposed to happen in it. Nobody was paying attention to the screen. They were paying attention to my cousin Brett, who had just been promoted, and to my cousin Melissa, who was expecting her second child, and to my brother Garrett, who had apparently said something very funny in the car on the way over that everyone had already heard twice but was still laughing about. I poured water into my glass. My aunt said, "It's so good to have everyone together." My mother looked at me. Then she said, "Almost everyone." I kept my hand on the water glass. I did not look up. That was the first one. The second came 20 minutes later, when my uncle was talking about Garrett's new job, and someone asked about me, and my mother said, "She keeps trying things. Nothing's really stuck yet." I was 33 years old. I had worked in the same field for 8 years. Nothing had stuck. The third one was the one that used the word. It came from my aunt, not cruelly. That was the thing about my family. The worst things arrived in a tone of mild, social concern. She was talking about something else entirely, some general observation about young people today, and then she said, "Some people are just, I don't know, they seem worthless to themselves until someone tells them what they're for." She wasn't looking at me when she said it, but my mother was, and my mother didn't look away. I cut a piece of chicken. I put it in my mouth. I chewed. If you have ever sat at a table with people who share your blood and felt more alone than you would have felt eating by yourself in a parking lot, stay with me for a second. Like this, if you have ever had to perform fine so well that the people performing it with you forgot you were all acting. I'll be right back with you. I had known the screen would light up that night. I had known for 6 weeks. I had not told anyone in that room. Not because I was planning something, because I had spent enough years trying to share good news with people who found a way to make it smaller, and I had finally gotten tired of handing them the opportunity. I kept eating. My aunt asked Melissa about the nursery. Garrett said something else that was apparently funny. The screen behind them stayed dark. For now. There is a word my family used for the children who required less management. Self-sufficient. They meant it as a compliment. I know that now. I also know that in my family, self-sufficient meant we don't have to think about her much, which was a relief to everyone, including sometimes me. I had been self-sufficient since I was 15. That was the year my parents decided Garrett needed a tutor, a therapist, and a college counselor, because Garrett was bright but struggled with focus, which was true, and also because Garrett was the kind of boy my parents had always imagined having, which was also true and harder to say out loud. I did not struggle with focus. I had 2 jobs by 17, a full scholarship by 18, a lease in my own name by 21, which my mother mentioned at the time, mostly in the context of hoping I wasn't being impulsive. I was not being impulsive. I was being precise. There is a difference, but it requires someone to be paying attention to notice it. My father paid attention to Garrett's grades the way other men followed sports. Closely, emotionally, with a kind of investment that meant the outcomes felt personal. My grades arrived and were noted, and then the conversation moved on. Once, when I was 19, I got the highest mark in my department on an exam that the professor told us afterward only 4 students in 10 years had passed cleanly. I called home. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." Then she said, Oh, before I forget, your father and I are thinking of redoing the kitchen. Do you think white cabinets are too much? I said I didn't know. She said, "You're probably right." I don't tell that story to make her sound like a villain. I tell it because that conversation is the most accurate photograph I have of what self-sufficient actually meant in my family. It meant your wins are yours to carry. Your losses are yours to carry. The kitchen is something we can all discuss together. By the time I was sitting at Philip's table that night, I had been carrying things alone for so long that I had stopped noticing the weight. You get used to it. That's the dangerous part. You stop feeling it as a burden and start feeling it as just the way your body is shaped. My colleague Dara had told me once that I held my shoulders like someone who was always prepared to be handed something. I had laughed. She hadn't. She said, "I mean it. You look like you're always waiting for the next thing to carry." I thought about that a lot in the months after. I need to stop here for a second. What happened that night is true. I've compressed a few things, moved the detail or two for clarity, and I sometimes use AI to help me hold the shape of a story I've told pieces of for years without ever telling all at once. None of that changes the table. None of it changes the word my aunt used, or the way my mother looked at me when she used it. If you have ever been the self-sufficient one, the one whose wins got noted and moved past, whose name came up in conversations about what hadn't happened yet rather than what had, subscribe and stay with me. You already know the loneliness isn't in the big moments. It's in the kitchen cabinet conversations. My family had a hierarchy the way most families have furniture. It was just there. You didn't question it because it had been there longer than you had, and it held things up. Garrett was the eldest son and the one my parents worried about, which, in my family, was the same as being loved loudly. I was the younger daughter and the one they didn't worry about, which, in my family, was the same as being loved quietly. Quietly enough that sometimes I had to check. The checking looked like calling home more than they called me, showing up at things they hadn't specifically invited me to, because I had learned that not being excluded was not the same as being included, but it was what was available. Bringing food to gatherings nobody asked me to bring, because contribution was a language they understood better than presents. I brought a pie to Philip's dinner, pecan, from scratch. My aunt said, "Oh, how sweet," and put it on the side table with the store-bought desserts, and did not mention it again. I found this out later from Dara, who had come as Philip's guest, and who pulled me aside after the salad course to say, quietly, "I saw what your mom said when you walked in." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The nothing's really stuck part." I looked at my plate. She said, "For what it's worth, the announcement tonight is going to be uncomfortable for some people at this table." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "I've been ready for 6 weeks." She squeezed my arm once. Then she went back to her seat, and I went back to mine. The invitation had come on a Thursday, plain envelope, my name on the front in the kind of font that means someone made a decision about it. Inside, a letter on heavy paper from the regional foundation that administered the grant. I had applied 8 months earlier. I had not told my family I applied. Not because I thought I would fail, I thought I might, the same way you think you might when something matters. But because I had learned over years that announcing attempts in my family created a particular kind of attention that felt like support, but functioned like pressure with good manners. So I had applied alone. I had done the work alone. I had submitted the materials alone on a Sunday night in March with a cup of cold coffee and my laptop on the kitchen table, and nobody waiting to hear how it went. The letter said I had been selected. It said my name would be announced at the regional dinner. It said the dinner was in 6 weeks. It gave the venue. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it back into the envelope and put it in the drawer with my passport and my lease and the other documents I kept in order, because no one else was going to keep them for me. I called Dara. She said, "I knew it." I said, "You didn't know." She said, "I knew." Then she said, "Are you going to tell your family?" I was quiet for a moment. I thought about my mother's voice, the kitchen cabinets, the way good news traveled in my family, arriving, being acknowledged, then immediately being repurposed into a conversation about something else. I said, "Philip's hosting the family dinner the night before." Dara said, "Yes." I said, "In the same venue." She was quiet. Then she said, "The screen." I said, "They do a preview run the night before. All the names go up." Another pause. Then Dara said, very carefully, "So they'll see it." I said, "If they happen to look up." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure about this?" I thought about the pie I would bring, the chair near the middle, the water glass I would keep my hand on when the words arrived, because they always arrived, and I had learned that stillness was a better response than reaction when you already knew what was coming. I said, "I've been sure for a long time." At the table, between the main course and dessert, my uncle was telling a story about a colleague of his who had started a business that failed. The moral of the story was something about knowing your limits. He told it in the general, sociable way people tell stories that aren't about anyone in particular, but somehow always seem to land near one specific person at the table. I refilled my water glass. My mother glanced at me. I looked at the screen. Still dark. But not for much longer. The catering staff had started moving around the edges of the room, clearing plates, setting up for dessert. One of them reached toward the AV panel near the door. I put my fork down, picked up my water glass, and waited. The screen came on without announcement. That was the thing nobody expected. No introduction, no dimming of lights, just the quiet mechanical sound of a projector warming up, and then light, spreading across the white panel at the front of the room, the way morning comes through a window you forgot to close. My uncle stopped talking mid-sentence. Everyone at the table looked up. The screen was running through the preview sequence for the following night's event. Foundation logo, a few lines of text about the program, and then the list of names. Honorees, regional grant recipients, the year's selected fellows. The names appeared one at a time. I watched my family read them. I watched Garrett frown slightly, the way he did when he was processing something he hadn't been briefed on. I watched my mother's eyes move down the list. I watched them stop. My name is not a common one. There was no possibility of confusion. My mother read it once. Then she read it again. I know because I was watching her face, and I saw the exact moment the second reading happened. A small stillness. The kind that comes after your brain has confirmed something your eyes reported and your brain initially rejected. My aunt said, "What is that?" Nobody answered. Dara, across the table, looked at her water glass. Then my mother said, "Is that?" She stopped. Then, "That's your name." She was looking at me. I said, "Yes." She said, "What is this for?" I said, "A grant. Regional Foundation. They announce the fellows tomorrow night." The table was very quiet. My uncle said, "You applied for a grant?" I said, 8 months ago. He said, "And you didn't say anything?" I said, "No." Garrett said, "Why not?" I looked at him. I said, "I wasn't sure I'd get it." That was true. It was not the whole truth, but it was the part I was willing to put on the table. My mother opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she said, "Well, we had no idea you were even working on something like this." There it was, the repositioning. The gentle administrative move my family had always been good at. Taking new information and surrounding it with the frame of their own prior ignorance, so the story became about what they hadn't known rather than what I had done. We had no idea, as if the grant had happened to me rather than been built by me over 8 months of work they had never asked about. My aunt said, "It's wonderful, of course. We just wish you'd shared." Shared. As if I had kept a secret from people who had been paying attention and waiting. I looked at the screen. My name was still there. White text on dark background. Still and clear and not asking anyone's permission to exist. Then Dara said from across the table, quietly but fully audible, "She submitted 70 pages of original work for that application. The selection rate is under 4%. Nobody had asked. She said it anyway. The room absorbed it. My cousin Melissa said, 70 pages? Dara said, the review panel selects 3 fellows per region. This year there were over 200 applicants. My uncle looked at me. His expression had changed. Not dramatically, but the way a room changes temperature, not in one moment, but in the accumulation of several seconds until suddenly it is different, and you cannot point to the exact instant it shifted. He said, 200 applicants. I said, 214. He nodded once, slowly. My mother had not said anything since the repositioning. I looked at her. Her eyes were still on the screen. Then she said, very quietly, and I believe she did not fully intend for it to be heard by everyone, I didn't know she was doing this. Not, I'm proud of her, not, of course she did, just, I didn't know. The honest version. The one that said more than she meant it to. I picked up my water glass. I said, I know. Then I drank. And the screen stayed lit behind them, steady and unhurried, with my name on it in the same font as everyone else's. Not at the end of the list and not at the edge of the frame. Right there, in the middle, where it had always belonged. If someone called you worthless, and then the world handed you proof they were wrong, would you show them the proof? Or would you let them find it themselves? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. The formal announcement was the following evening. I wore a blue dress I had bought 3 months earlier and hung in the back of my closet for occasions I wasn't sure would come. It had come. I wore the dress. Dara sat beside me at the fellows' table. When they called my name, she put her hand briefly on my arm. Then I walked to the front of the room. The foundation director shook my hand. She said, Your application was one of the strongest we've seen in this category in several years. I said, Thank you. She said my name into the microphone. The room applauded. I stood at the front and looked out at the audience and thought, for one strange second, about the table the night before. The china. The good water glasses. My aunt's voice carrying the word across the salad course like it was just another observation about the world. Worthless. I thought about how long that word had lived in my family's vocabulary for me. Not always spoken, more often just present. In the way my wins were noted and moved past. In the kitchen cabinet conversations. In the calls I made more often than I received. In the space between self-sufficient and invisible, which in my family had always been narrower than anyone admitted. I thought about the drawer with my passport and my lease and the acceptance letter I had folded back into its envelope on a Sunday night with cold coffee. I had not taken that letter out to show anyone. Not my mother, not Garrett, not my aunt with her social observations and her mild, general cruelties. I had put it in the drawer because I had learned, by then, that some things are more protected by being kept than by being shared. And I had been right. Because here was what had happened instead. The room had done the work. The screen had done the work. 70 pages and 8 months and 214 applicants had done the work. And I had sat at the table and eaten my dinner and held my water glass and let the proof arrive in its own time, in its own form, in front of people I could not have chosen more carefully if I had tried. After the ceremony, my phone had 3 messages. My uncle, congratulations, truly. Melissa, I had no idea. I'm so sorry we didn't know. That sounds incredible. And my mother. Her message was longer. She had clearly typed it and deleted it at least once, because there was a quality to the final version that felt like a second draft. Careful. Slower than her usual texts. She said, "I've been thinking about last night. I don't think I've been paying the right kind of attention. I'd like to do better at that. Congratulations on tonight. I mean it." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my bag. Not because I didn't believe her, because I had learned over a long time that believing someone and trusting a pattern were two different things, and I was trying to get better at not confusing them. The dress went back in the closet. Not the back this time. Front section, easy reach. The letter from the foundation went on the desk, not in the drawer, out, where I could see it in the mornings when I sat down to work. I did not call my mother back that night. I called Dara. She answered on the second ring. I said, she texted. She said, "I saw you smiling at your phone." I said, "She said she wants to pay better attention." Dara said, "That's something." I said, "It's a start." She said, "How do you feel?" I looked out the window. The street was ordinary and dark and completely unaware that anything had shifted in the life of the person watching it from the second floor. I said, "Like I've been carrying a word around for a long time that doesn't fit me." She said, "And now?" I said, "And now I think I'll put it down." Thank you for staying with me through this one. If you have ever been the self-sufficient one, the one whose name came up in conversations about what hadn't happened yet, the one whose good news arrived and got moved past, the one who brought the pie and watched it get set to the side, I hope you remember this. The people who call you worthless are usually the ones who never bothered to find out what you were worth. Subscribe if you want to stay with stories like this one. Leave a comment if any part of this felt familiar. And if you have something in a drawer that deserves to be on your desk, maybe tonight is the night you move it.